May God open our eyes to see, our ears to hear, our hearts to love. Amen. As long as you're dancing, you can break the rules. Sometimes breaking the rules is just extending the rules. Sometimes there are no rules. Like Mary Oliver, those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s have complex relations to a list of laws or rules like the Ten Commandments. Who's telling me what I can or cannot do? Why? Why shouldn't I do this? Do these rules still apply? The negative formulation of the commandments in terms of thou shalt not is a problem for Christian public relations. Secular society sees Christianity as consisting of a list of things we should not do. The overwhelming public message of Christianity to Australia today is thou shalt not be homosexual. And if thou art homosexual, thou art definitely not going to be blessed with the social recognition and legal protections of marriage. But questioning the rules, questioning authority, is, I believe, part of what it is to be a thoughtful, reflective human. But my experience in moderating the Australian Christians for Marriage Equality Facebook page is that many Christians claim that the rules are unchangeable and that even to question the rules is sinful. Those of us who are running the page have been called wolves in sheep's clothing, leading God's children astray with false teaching. In interpreting Scripture and inviting people to look at Hebrew and Greek words and roots and meanings, and questioning conventional translations of texts that are used to condemn, we are considered to be guilty of law-breaking, and we have frequently been told that God will cast us into the pit of eternal fire. Sadly, unquestioning adherence to rules, to keeping the commandments of a wrathful God whose key message is thou shalt not, also characterises how many secular people in Australia understand Christianity today. I've been surprised to read comments by atheists telling us that we cannot be Christian and support marriage equality because our sacred texts are abundantly clear in their denunciation of homosexuality. So some atheists and most fundamentalist Christians have suggested that if we question the Bible on this teaching, we should stop calling ourselves Christian. So on this Sunday morning in the springtime of 2017, how should we, as people who seek to follow the way of Jesus, engage with these ancient commandments? We begin by examining what we know of how they were received and understood by the ancient Israelites and later by the early Christians. They are framed as a list of things that people should not do, because this is the way that ancient laws were written in the ancient Near East. We often prefer Jesus' shorter expression of the commandments, love God and love your neighbour as yourself. But Jesus did not invent these commandments. They were not contradictions of the Jewish teaching that he had inherited. Jesus was quoting from other parts of Hebrew Scripture, from Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. I think it's easier for us to hear the Ten Commandments as expressions of hope, such as we sang in Bill Wallace's hymn. Another way of expressing it might be to think of them in terms of our hope for life lived in harmony with the sacred. May our lives centre on God and God's will for us. May we understand that God cannot be captured and made to serve us. May we have respect for the sacred. May we be mindful of God's creative power and refreshed to participate as co-creators. May we care for others as God has cared for us. May we have reverence for life. May we be faithful to one another and to the promises that we make. May we have regard for the rights of others. May our words be truthful. May we enjoy the blessings we receive and share them generously. Those words from a prayer litany and Bill Wallace's hymn help us to sense the positive, find what is life-giving in the Ten Commandments. But I think that re-expressing them as positive and aspirational is not sufficient. We do also need to face their limitations and their potential to perpetuate understandings of the divine and of human community that are not life-giving. Many Christians, especially Christians in the United States, regard the Ten Commandments as general statements of how life should be organised and how people should relate to each other. They think of them as basic principles, which everyone could agree with and ascribe to. But Exodus chapter 20 gives us a different picture. These are laws given by Yahweh, the God of Israel, on the basis of the covenant relationship between Yahweh and the people. They are a consequence from a particular time and place of the Exodus event of liberation from Egypt. In essence, because of what the deity has done for the nation, they have reciprocal responsibilities in allegiance to the deity. The content of the law raises serious problems in relation to gender and social class. A problem for modern hearers is that we no longer believe in some of the values reflected in these commandments. They reflect a patriarchal society in which slavery was still practiced. The laws are addressed to men. In Hebrew, the you to whom the laws are addressed is masculine singular. In other words, these laws specifically are addressed to a man and not to a woman. The 10th commandment stipulates that a person must not covet his neighbour's house, wife, male or female slave, ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbour. It is clear from this commandment that the neighbour must also be a man, since he has a wife. It is clear that the man's neighbour owns property, human, animal, and land, and that his wife is considered part of that property, as she is listed amongst the house, cattle, land, slaves, and other belongings. And the abundance of property mentioned suggests that these laws mainly protected men of wealth. The commandment prohibiting adultery also relates to a violation of property rights. In ancient Israelite understanding, adultery was defined as sexual intercourse between a married or engaged woman and a man who was not her husband or betrothed. The same rules did not apply to men. A married man did not sin against his wife by having extramarital relations because he did not belong to her in the same way that she belonged to him. The commandments also include problematic understandings of human slavery and treatment of non-Israelite people. It is perhaps surprising that the Israelites were slave masters because these laws open with the declaration that the basis of the divine-human relationship is the Israelites' liberation from slavery. But the Sabbath law indicates that slavery was an acceptable social order. It implies that the Israelites' enslavement by the Egyptians was wrong, but Israelite slaveholding was acceptable. The neighbour, mentioned in verses 16 and 17, is also of concern. From other usages of this term, we know that it refers to an individual who is related to one's own ethnic or family group, or an in-law. These laws speak to how Israelites should relate to other Israelites, but they do not require this treatment of foreign people. The 10 Commandments also raise questions about the character of the God who gave them, who describes God's own nature as jealous. The formula, I am Yahweh, appears through Exodus chapters 1 to 12 as God's motive for liberating the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The stated reason for the Israelites' liberation is so that both the Egyptians and the Israelites will know who Yahweh is. This fits Yahweh's self-description as jealous. Given the Israelites' understanding of adultery, if God is a jealous husband and Israel is the wayward wife, this suggests that the people were the property of Yahweh, and could also explain why Moses told the people to fear Yahweh. These commandments present Yahweh as a deity who liberated a people so that they could be God's property and serve God in exchange. Yahweh, in response, established laws that included the protection of the property rights of wealthy men and regarded women as property. Given these underlying assumptions of the Ten Commandments, we should indeed be questioning these laws and their applicability to us and to our society. And we should be questioning those Christians who want to make negative, punitive laws the basis of both religious and social order. It strikes me reading the commandments that they are very light on love. They are a powerful statement about placing God at the centre of our lives, and they underscore that in order to live in community, humans have always placed restrictions on freedom. However, the only mention of love refers to God's relationship with humanity, and love occurs nowhere in the last 6 commandments, which deal with the relationships between people. These last 6 commandments give humanity a guide in avoiding exploitation and abuse, but they do not go further to require love, service, commitment, or self-giving. It is worth noting, at a time when right-wing politicians are undergirding their platforms with a call to give priority to religious rules and dogma, that love is not at the centre of their vision either. Love does not feature in the campaign opposing marriage equality. Love is not a concern of the perpetrators of injustice and abuse against asylum seekers. Love is not on the agenda of drug testing beneficiaries or on the mass incarceration of Aboriginal people. Love is not at work in plans to rape the earth for profit and steal its future from our children and grandchildren. No one is spending millions of dollars, as the Coalition for Marriages, to enshrine a religious agenda based on the love of God and neighbour. The religious right is not proclaiming Micah 6:8 about doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God. Conservative think tank analysts are not claiming that our laws should be based on Matthew 25:40. As you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. So we need to remember what the Ten Commandments proclaim and what they do not proclaim. But naming the issues, the problems with the Ten Commandments, doesn't require us to reject out of hand the seeds of wisdom that may enrich our community as Jesus followers. I think it's helpful to recognise that the context of the commandments is a time of new beginning, and there are many times of new beginning throughout Scripture. These are times when values are reoriented and re-expressed. After their escape from Egypt, the Israelites faced a new beginning at Sinai. Gone are the days of their exploitation in Egypt. Now the laws provide the Israelites an opportunity to root their new society in the true God, to base it on something other than exploitation. No more shall the key to success be found in cheating, stealing, and killing. Now the good life will lie in relationship with the true God and with the community. As we face new beginnings, political and personal, the story of Sinai reminds us to ask, who will be our God? Who will be our God? The Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann has written about some of the seeds of wisdom that we can find in these commandments, inviting us to think about what honouring the Sabbath might mean for us. According to the sacred story of the Exodus, which is important to say is not a factual history, but a reimagination of periods of war and servitude and expulsion of Semitic people in Egypt. According to that sacred story of the Israelites, they were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. During that time, the Sabbath became crucial in the maintenance of their identity as the people of God. Maintaining the Sabbath embodied a strong statement that God's people resisted a system that exploited and abused them. Brueggemann says that the Sabbath is a political assertion of disengagement from the economic system of productivity that never has enough. So the relevance of the Sabbath to us is not limited to rest and play and worship and to the experience of my grandmother's forebears in Scotland where the swings got tied up in the playground on Sunday because you shouldn't do anything that was fun. Sabbath observance instead makes a forceful political statement that the economic system that we live in is broken. Many people today work in jobs that exploit them by continually demanding more commitment and more time to the detriment of health and family. For us, honouring the Sabbath serves as a protest against that system and affirms that the system does not reflect God's will. So we express that politically in fighting for penalty rates for people who must work on the weekend and in advocating for a living wage. And we express it personally in the choices we make, that work will not define all of who we are, that it will not separate us from family and those we love. The only other commandment that I want to pay particular attention to this morning is the one that prohibits idolatry. The word idolatry sounds archaic to contemporary ears. There are no golden calves these days. But the 20th century theologian Paul Tillich saw that idolatry was alive and well in the wholehearted pursuit of professional success and economic power and nationalism. We elevate mundane pursuits to the position of gods, worshipping them at the expense of everything else. Even our dedication to family, fitness, and community involvement can become idols. We centre our faith in the totality of our potential well-being on those elements of life that seem to promise us complete fulfilment. These false gods eventually leave us feeling more hopeless and despairing. The idol that fills the space where the sacred should be cannot ever cultivate within us integrity, well-being or shalom, the sense of being whole and fulfilled that we desperately seek. Many of us live in fear that loneliness, agitation, desperation, and longing that can overtake us and have no resolution. Therefore, we invest ourselves in temporary fixes to fill up the spaces where loneliness, fear, and anxiety reside. Relying on that which is not God will leave us more lonely, fearful, and desperate when its power evaporates. So we can embrace and critique these commandments, remembering that they were not given to burden the people, but so that the people might have freedom to trust each other and their God. At their best, they were not intended to restrict or deny life, but to enhance it, It was from this solid base of common care, of common ideals and respect, that God's people would build and change their world, however imperfectly. And it was this faith that shaped the faith of Jesus, who called us to care for the vineyard, to reject the ways of violence, to seek life. God keeps giving us new opportunities. God is that which calls us to new beginning, to a new way of seeing, acknowledging, seeking justice and practicing compassion for all people and the earth. Let us acknowledge the grace of God, reaching out to us in this time and place, enabling and empowering us to do what we are called to do, to love God and to love our neighbours as ourselves. Amen.